Because of American leadership and resolve, the world is changing for the better. Last month, the leader of Libya voluntarily pledged to disclose and dismantle all of his regime's weapons of mass destruction programs, including a uranium enrichment project for nuclear weapons. Colonel Gadhafi correctly judged that his country would be better off and far more secure without weapons of mass murder. 9 months of intense negotiations involving the United States and Great Britain succeeded with Libya, while 12 years of diplomacy with Iraq did not. And one reason is clear. For diplomacy to be effective, words must be credible, and no one can now doubt the word of America.
That was President Bush during his 2004 State of the Union address. Joining me now, returning the panel, Andrea Mitchell, Steve Clemens, Bobby Ghosh, and Gene Robinson. Andrea Mitchell, take us from there to here. How did we go from President Bush's optimism about future relations with Gadhafi to where we are today?
Well, we had that optimism, and then they moved towards normalizing relations, taking him off the terror list once he agreed to make the payments to the Pan Am family and gave up those nuclear components. They were centrifuges. I went down to Tennessee. We did reports there when they were delivered. It was not a full-scale weapons program, but they were certainly the parts for the weapons program. And then Condoleezza Rice went in 2008. She was the first Secretary of State, of course, to go to Tripoli in many, many decades. And Hillary Clinton actually went back to Tripoli 2 days ago. Again, the first Secretary of State since then, the first Secretary of State, the highest-ranking official since the Civil War. But what happened between 2008, when we were normalizing relations, and even in 2009, Barack Obama was shaking hands at the UN with Muammar Gadhafi, what happened was the Arab Spring, the uprising where the president and his foreign policy advisors felt that they had to side with the Libyan people, and there was very strong leadership from Britain and France pushing in that direction.
Bobby Ghosh, how has the United States been seen in its shifting positions, in particular, just using Libya as an example? It would be, it seems to me, not clear to people in the region why the United States shifts its positions this way.
Well, there's often the accusation that the U.S. went along on this path with Libya, but not so much in Bahrain, where people rose up against their rulers, the king, and the United States did essentially nothing. But it's important to remember that this new doctrine, if you like, that Obama was able to unleash in Libya was based on 4 fundamental things. The Libyan people wanted it, wanted foreign intervention. The Arab League wanted foreign intervention. There were allies willing to go along, and the United Nations signed off on it. Those 4 things almost never happen simultaneously in any other circumstance. So the president was able to craft this policy because he had all of that going for him. Now, people on the ground in the Middle East don't always see it that way, so you're always going to get people saying, well, why aren't we bombing? Why isn't the United States, why isn't NATO bombing Syria? Well, the Arab League isn't calling for it. A lot of Syrians are not yet calling for it, and clearly there is no United Nations support for it. So the things that worked for, the formula is very specific. It worked for Libya. It may not necessarily work in other places.
Gene Robinson, Andrew Sullivan, a conservative, wrote on his blog today, to rid the world of Osama bin Laden, Anwar al-Awlaki, and Muammar Gadhafi within 6 months. If Obama were a Republican, he'd be on Mount Rushmore by now. There's something to that, isn't there?
Well, there is. Of course, he's not going to get that sort of credit. You saw Mitt Romney's reaction with this sort of terse, well, I suppose he gets some credit, and you've heard nothing essentially from the other candidates. Look, nonetheless, President Obama has a record of foreign policy success that he'll be able to take on the campaign trail with him this year, and, you know, not a lot of voters perhaps will make their decision based on foreign policy, but some will, and so if you've got a horn to toot, you should toot it.
Steve Clemens, where do we go from here in Libya?
Well, I think that we need to encourage as best we can the National Transition Council to get its act together to figure out who the heroes of the revolution are. There are a lot of new players that came inside Libya in these last 2 months that weren't part of the original Benghazi coalition. They need to be built in. And we also need to make sure that we keep this a Libyan story and not do victory laps, constantly talking about all we did. There's a very strong anti-colonial, anti-Western sentiment inside Libya. Even with all that we did, there will continue to be politically palpable and consequential there, and I think we need to be respectful of that process. They're going to have some struggles. Their problems won't be money, it's going to be sorting out power. And I think we need to be respectful of that and try and guide and encourage and hook them up to as many international institutions and networks as possible to try to create some peer pressure support for what's going on inside.
Andrea Mitchell, it's always been, or maybe not always, correct us about this, how difficult is it for presidents to do victory laps on foreign policy successes and translate them into re-election successes? I'm thinking of the first President Bush, who had a, for him, spectacular foreign policy success in the first Iraq War, which went easier than anyone ever imagined, and then he was easily, in effect, in the end, defeated in his re-election by Bill Clinton. How does the president use any of this? Is there a way, in your experience, for a president to successfully use any of this in his re-election campaign?
Well, it would seem that a Democratic president, especially one without any military experience, has to prove his bona fides on foreign policy and on military experience, and certainly Barack Obama has done that, and done it in spectacular fashion with Osama bin Laden and some of the other, military achievements, military and intelligence achievements. That said, Americans are voting their pocketbooks right now for very good reasons. They did that back in 1992 to a certain extent, and certainly the victory in the first Gulf War did not ultimately help George Bush get reelected. And right now, more so than ever, after what we've all experienced, this is really a domestic policy, economic election. I think that there has to be sort of a threshold test passed by all of the candidates, whoever is going to be the Republican nominee and President Obama, but it's not going to be the ticket to re-election for this president. It could be a disabling factor for one of the Republicans, depending on who is the nominee, judging from the debates so far, unless they really begin to study up and have a more coherent foreign policy.
That'll have to be the last word for tonight. I want to thank you all for joining me. Andrea Mitchell, Eugene Robinson, Steve Clemens, and Bobby Ghosh. Thank you all very much for joining me tonight.